I reach a point, as I think everyone does, when I just sit back in amazement and fury at the amorality and greed of people like Jeff Bezos. Look, I'm not naive. I see quite clearly the deeply immoral and corrupt economic system that has robbed millions of people across the globe. But I don't want to ever get so used to it that it just becomes the background noise or something I shrug about it. None of us should. During this entire pandemic, which is now approaching a full year of horror and destitution for so many, I've pointed out that the virus has just exposed the sickness that we've lived with for decades. A sickness where a handful of people become filthy rich at the expense of everyone else. You can see that in the poverty level minimum wage, which means that people labor like slaves to make the likes of the Waltons of Walmart billions of dollars in profits. Or the lack of paid sick leave, which is a main reason so many people have gotten sick on the job and then died because they could not afford to stay home from work when they got sick. This is a global sickness. It's, in a way, an immoral economic pandemic that the coronavirus has just shown a very bright light on. Now, each year, Oxfam comes out with an annual report on global inequality that is timed for the annual Davos conference. You know, the place where the rich, the elites fly in on their private planes to perform for each other and lord themselves over the rest of the planet, sprinkled with a few words or panels about social responsibility. Hey, you know, I have a solution. Just cancel Davos and just turn over your trillions in wealth to the people. Anyway, each year at least, I have the pleasure to talk about this gross reality of inequality with a great person, Paul O'Brien, who is the Vice President for Policy and Advocacy at Oxfam America, and we're lucky to have Paul here today. So, Paul, we have now done this conversation about global inequality based on the incredible reports that Oxfam turns out each year. We've done this 3 years in a row. And I want to start actually with this macro view, and I want to read from your report a really important little snippet and let you then react to that. And I'm going to read from this. And your report is so important that I have stuff spread all over my desk, and I realize that I need a much bigger desk when I'm doing Oxfam reports because I kind of want to read from everything. But here's an important point that I think you all made, that the virus hit an already profoundly unequal world. And it's things that you and I have talked about. And what you write here is, and I'm quoting now, a world where a tiny group of over 2,000 billionaires had more wealth than they could spend in 1,000 lifetimes. A world where nearly half of humanity was forced to scrape by on less than $5.50 a day. A world where for 40 years the richest 1% have earned more than double the income of the bottom half of the global population. A world where the richest 1% have consumed twice as much carbon as the bottom 50% for the last quarter of a century, driving climate destruction. And the point you really make here, which is really, really stupendous, is that while we're going to talk mostly about the way in which the virus has exacerbated, the pandemic has exacerbated inequality, it has done that based on inequality that has kind of grown for generations, right?
Yeah. Yeah, totally right, Jonathan. It's a sad truth. We started doing these reports in 2014, January, so this is the 8th one. We timed it for when the rich and famous gathered in Davos in their fur coats and their planes jetting in to talk about carbon emissions and other great things. And ever since we started, it's gotten worse. When early 2007, 2008, at the last crisis, there were about 750 billionaires in the world. And as you just said, now we've got 2,200 or more, and they are just doing so well. The big fact in the report is that the richest 10 people made enough money during the pandemic to vaccinate everyone on the planet Earth if we had the actual vaccines, to pay for it all. So you imagine this. I mean, they could be sitting around a dinner table and think like, well, now, let's obviously not diminish our wealth. Let's just take the excess profits we made during the pandemic. What will we do with that? I've got an idea. How about we end the pandemic everywhere on the planet Earth for everyone? That's a great idea. Can we afford it? Oh, yes, and we'll still be as rich as we were. It's ludicrous. Now, wonderful, wouldn't it be if that dinner party actually happened? But the problem is it shouldn't be about that dinner party. It shouldn't be a voluntary or philanthropic exercise for these guys to decide what to do with their leftover money. So yeah, it's been a great year for the richest. It's been a really good time for those who are super rich. Top 1,000 basically made all their money back in the first 9 months. But it has been terrible, catastrophic for those on the wrong end of inequality. The last time we did this report a year ago, one of the things we said was, look, if there is a crisis, people who are living on $5.50 a day are in deep trouble because they may lose their job that was at least giving them one meal a day. And we didn't even imagine at that point, at January, even though we might have, that the crisis that would come would actually make it dangerous for them to keep working, to go out into the workplace as an essential worker or as a care worker. We didn't imagine that they would all, particularly if they lived in large urban slums, be in lockdowns and be prevented from moving, except if they were considered essential and could put themselves in harm's way. We didn't imagine that just sitting around in their home, unemployed, because 2 billion people went into the informal economy, would be a threat to their lives, because they can't do social distancing if there's no PPE and there's no distance. When you've got 1 million people living in a square mile in Kibera or many of the other slums in South Asia, Africa, or Latin America, Mexico, I'm thinking of, this pandemic landed in completely different ways for people. Some did really well and others hurt.
That's a really good point about the question of social distancing and the way in which inequality has affected people. And I was laying in bed last night reading your report. This is what you do to me, Paul, in terms of my social life.
I'm sorry.
I lay in bed, I read your report, and I think about it. And I did just a quick mental calculation. What would happen if Jeff Bezos, who I really detest, I think he is the example of amorality on steroids, if he took those excess profits that he made, which were huge, billions of dollars, and he simply said, I am going to rent hotel rooms on my dime for the rest of the pandemic to allow those people who are living, and I'm going to take the US example, are living in very close quarters. And we know this is affecting people of color especially, and this is why you see the pandemic especially hitting people of color in the United States, because they live in communities where they often share small spaces. You have 6, 8, 10 people living in a one-bedroom apartment, which in some respects is much better, as you quite well know, than lots of people in the third world. He could actually make a difference in terms of saving people's lives just by doing that, and still have more wealth than he could spend for 100 lifetimes.
Yes, that's actually lovely. Not lovely, it's terrifying, but it's a way to understand. It's so hard to get our heads around the scale of their wealth, right? And just putting it into context. I'll tell you a funny story, actually. As we were developing the analysis of the report in late September, we calculated that if he handed a check of $105,000 to every one of his employees, and that was at the time 875,000 people, if he just went up to each one of those almost 1 million people and handed them a check for more than most of us earn in a year, he'd still have more money than he started the pandemic with. But the struggle with using that fact was, by the time the report came out, just 8 weeks later, he'd hired another almost 400,000 people to run his shop. So, and was making more money, and now is, in this battle with your man who does Tesla over, like, can one of them be the first trillionaire? So one of the things, we literally have people who sit around to say, how do we explain to folks how much $100 billion actually is, so that we can grasp how clearly a symptom of a broken economic model this is? We're not people who believe you shouldn't be able to work hard and earn money, and some people are going to earn more than others. We're not against talent or hard work or functioning regulated markets where workers are protected and entrepreneurship is rewarded. What we're opposing is the scale of opportunism and basically power that comes along with that amount of money that makes it impossible for a lot of people to get ahead, while these folks are able to literally change the fate of nations, of peoples, of currencies, of whole societies and economies. It just isn't healthy.
I'm going to come back to that in a minute because I might have a slight disagreement with you about that ideological positioning. It might be slight, but I do want to say one more thing about Elon Musk and Bezos and those others. Those folks who increased their wealth, they increased their wealth partly because of the pandemic, because of the crisis, because people were forced to stay home. They were sick or there were a lockdown. So all of a sudden, Amazon became this service that people really needed because people were sitting at home and doing a lot of online shopping. And you look at those folks who especially made money, they actually exploited the pandemic to make even more money on the backs of people who were under siege.
Yeah. It's, whether it's sort of an intent to use it or just the way that our economy is structured now, if you're ahead, if you're able to sit behind a desk as I am and earn money without doing anything more than being on a screen or doing research or engaging with others in the white collar economy, I'm fine. But if as long as I have a job, I'm fine. But if you're out there as an essential worker or a health worker, disproportionately women, disproportionately people of color, you are not fine in this pandemic. It has landed precisely as it's been so great for the richest amongst us. It's been terrifying for those who started off in a disadvantaged position. If we had the same number of Latinx and Black people facing mortality rates as white people have in this country, we would have 22,000 people alive today who are not with us. Because this has landed in the United States in disproportionately harmful ways for communities that were already facing structural racism, structural economic marginalization, and forced to be out there on the front lines of the crisis, taking the most risks.
And let's put a fine point on that really excellent point. We've done a segment after segment on this show going back to when the pandemic started with frontline workers, healthcare workers, the people who are retail workers who are in grocery stores, poultry workers. Oxfam has done really important work on the crisis for poultry workers even before the pandemic. And that's this point again, that these billionaires, these corporations have been making money on the sickness and dying of many workers because they couldn't be bothered to spend money to make sure that workplaces were safe, or if you weren't feeling well and you were ill, you had enough money to go home and get well and then come back to work. That certainly happened in the United States, and I'm sure, and help us a little bit with this, that's the picture all around the world, even more so in places where, my God, you think about places like India and other places, third world countries, where people crowd onto transportation vehicles where they can't socially distance because they had no choice. They had to go to work because otherwise they would starve.
That's right. So start with the United States. You mentioned poultry workers. We are very fortunate to be able to accompany poultry workers and the organizations that support them on fighting against structural inequality. So this has been a path we've been on, as you've covered in the years past. One story that came to us during the pandemic, somebody we've been working with, John Baptiste. He's a poultry worker, 44 years old, father of 3, and started to feel sick on the line, on the manufacturing line, told his employers. They said, get back to work. Temperature started to go up, told them, keep working. Got to a temperature above 40, and they said, go home. We can't help you, go home. We don't want you affecting anyone else now that we believe you're genuinely sick. His widow, because he passed a few days later, his widow went to the media and said he told them, they gave him no protection, and then they told him to go home, and now he's no longer with us, and I couldn't be with him during his last days because it was COVID. And the poultry factory sent him $100 check and said, thanks very much, we're done. So it's not just the zillionaires who have done very well. We have an economic system which so rewards unprotected work and those who are able to instrumentalize workers, that if you are in charge of resources in that way, unable to run factories, and there is almost no sanction for that kind of behavior, which is why even in the United States, we cannot take this moment and just revert back to what we called normal, because it was profoundly abnormal that that was allowed to happen. But I didn't want to dodge your question, Jonathan. I'm happy to talk, because Oxfam's privilege is not just to work in the United States. We are working alongside communities all around the world, and you're absolutely right. As it's not that it's tougher, but in economic terms, poverty is greater for sure. There are things that folks don't have in the places where we work. A couple of examples. Latin America, 30% of kids have no access to the internet or to any kind of virtual education. They cannot do homeschooling. So when the pandemic hits lockdown, they're just sitting around wondering when life begins again. India, where you mentioned, you've got a very tough lockdown going on. You have exactly what you mentioned, people unable to work in urban settings where social distancing is absolutely impossible. And you've got a pretty tough, and that's a euphemism, regime that has refused even to look after the most vulnerable in its own population. So they're starting to manufacture vaccines, but they've made pretty clear that Dalits, and that's 200 million people on the lower end of what they call the caste system, I shouldn't even use that word, are not going to get vaccines, are not going to get protected. And they're refusing, even though they are the one big production system in a democracy in the South that could help us get vaccines out to Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa in particular, they're refusing to export them because they want to make sure that their own more elites in India get taken care of. So all around the world, we're seeing rates, 9 out of 10 people having no access to a vaccine, not able to get back to work, dealing with the economic consequences of that, while northern economies are increasingly awash in vaccines. And frankly, we're all really worried about whether we're going to get them quickly enough. But it's not even close to a possibility that you're going to see vaccines in most poor countries in this year, 2021.
And what's bizarre about that, or stupid, even from a capitalist standpoint, is if folks aren't vaccinated around the world and you don't give it to people for free, and you don't use your wealth that you've accumulated, again, that you could not spend in 1,000 years, then economies are going to be shut down. They're going to remain on lockdown, and that then affects your bottom line if you're a capitalist. So it's also just foolish from your own self-interest standpoint to be so greedy.
Yep. I remember we talked about this when we talked about the China case, and we saw just 2 days ago, their growth numbers are skyrocketing. They're having a better year in 2020 than they had in 2019 growth-wise. And it's in part because there is no coronavirus there slowing things down. Now, we know they have an export market. They're very worried about precisely what you've said, because they want economies back up and functioning and buying Chinese products again. So they are doing vaccine diplomacy. And make no mistake, that is the #1 currency in 2021 in terms of determining who will have power and who won't. And meanwhile, we're letting a tiny number of US corporate interests dictate the price of vaccines, the distribution levels, and they're even manufacturing ones which are largely going to be irrelevant in the global South. So your point is exactly right, but we are missing the point in the United States in terms of demonstrating that we understand vaccines everywhere is the only way to get rid of this pandemic.
There's something to be said for having authoritarianism, right, in China, where they basically say this is what everybody's going to do or else. I'm being a little bit sarcastic, but it is true that in a country where essentially people in this case are told what to do and people have to act in unison, which you would hope would be done in a democratic society like the United States, then you can actually address the coronavirus. You can get the pandemic under control.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
I
You
mean,
know,
I'm
as
not
a human,
for that. Let's be clear. I know
sure,
you're not for that, obviously, because there are huge downside, the oppression of the Uyghurs, for example, in the
exactly,
western part of
exactly.
China and so on. So I don't want to, I want to be clear to my audience. I'm not holding up China as the model that we should use in this
But let
case.
but but let me rip off that for a sec, Jonathan, because yeah, I think you and I are in the same place. I come out of it as a human rights activist, both on the economic and social rights side and the civil and political side. And I'm never going to be someone who says the Chinese model of approaching human rights is the way forward for countries everywhere. But if you have an authoritarian state which is able to oppress its own population or parts of it on the one hand, and seemingly doing very well economically in terms of growth. You watch the Economist is all this week about how wonderfully China is doing in terms of its own confidence, massive numbers of youth, really patriotic and actually quite progressive. They're offering a cultural vision for the world now. It's not just the old China. And if that is all based, you've got all this patriotism towards an authoritarian model. And what we are offering is more of a rights-based model where people are free, where democracy and economics are supposed to work together to give everybody economic opportunity and the right to vote for the system you want. We have a deep threat on our hands because it would be naive to assume that people in sub-Saharan Africa or in Brazil or Chile or elsewhere aren't looking at the Chinese model and saying, you know, these northern countries and the United States has been offering us democracy and economics, but what I see over there is a very nice offer from China. And yeah, it's a little dodgy on political and civil rights, and they seem to be doing some things that are a little distasteful to some of their own folks, but you know, we've got to get ourselves out of this economic quandary. And that is a deeply frightening thing for a rights activist.
Okay, I want to do a little U.S. focus for a second
Yep.
because the outrageous wealth that these billionaires have accumulated really goes to the heart of the debate about how to bring relief to people here. And here's what I mean. And I want to make clear when I talk about these billionaires, I don't necessarily think of them as American, and I don't necessarily believe that they care about what flag they fly over their headquarters because they are globalists. They can talk all about they want about patriotism, but it really has no actual meaning. But let's for a moment call them U.S. billionaires, and I'm thinking of Jeff Bezos, for example. There is this crazy debate in the United States right now about whether we should spend X amount of money or Y amount of money. And you had, as you know, you've been watching this, you had the idiots who were saying, let's just give people one-time checks for $600. And when you think about that, that's kind of astonishing when you think about actually what it costs to live month to month. Then you had the more enlightened position of let's give people a $2,000 check, a one-time check, which I think also is crazy because the truth is you can't live on that for a long time, especially if you, for example, you have student debt, you're just trying to pay your rent in most urban settings. What I've argued, along with many, many other people like Pramila Jayapal, for example, in the House and Bernie Sanders in the Senate, people should get at least $2,000 every single month, up to, say, $90,000 a year in income, if your annual salary was up to $90,000 a year, to get people through the pandemic. And there's been this debate here, crazily, oh my God, we shouldn't be spending all this money. Now, actually, Janet Yellen, who, as you know, was just confirmed as the Treasury Secretary and was the former head of the Federal Reserve Board, and I can't believe that I'm about to praise someone who is the former chair of the Fed, she actually is saying we have to do massive spending right now. My point really is that here you have all these folks who are complaining about this, but it's not really a spending problem, it's a revenue problem because we can't get these people to pay their fair share in taxes.
So as you were saying that, a thought came to me, which is that the difference in the relief packages that were being debated initially, the 900 billion that would get $600 checks out there versus what's on the table now and the 2,000 checks. That amount, the difference, is essentially the same order of magnitude as the profits that these 10 billionaires made during the pandemic, not overall wealth, just their pandemic profits. So you're absolutely right on the scale. By the way, just to be right, I agree with you that they're globalists, but 7 out of the 10 of them are Americans. And so the government that can best regulate their wealth, power, and tax them is the United States government. And so it bears a special responsibility with respect to those 10. And I absolutely think we have to get there. But your other broader point is entirely right. We are failing to really grapple with the fact that if we want to rebuild an economy of opportunity, everything that where the money matches the dream of the United States, we cannot expect people to survive on just one-off $2,000 check and then everything's fine after what has been a devastating period in their lives where they've lost jobs, they've gone back either to unemployment, they're down to part-time work, or they're in more insecure work because folks don't want to hire and they have to engage more in the informal economy. If we want to transform this economy, what we cannot get out of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris is an effort to normalize this economy back to the way it was before, because that is just going to leave people falling further and further behind. There's an opportunity in this moment, Jonathan, because it's never been more stark that our economic system is broken, and the kinds of answers that you're offering are actually what people need to be seriously talking about, radically changing the scale of investment. And that means taking it out of the top and putting it where all economies are driven, into the hands of working people so that they can rebuild their lives.
And that's a perfect lead into the wrap-up question that kind of brings forward the point we were briefly talking about the system. You see, you and I have talked about this year after year about inequality, and nothing seems to change except it gets worse. Although it's obviously been exacerbated now for the first time in history because of the pandemic in terms of its scale. And you mentioned before that Oxfam, and this may be the position of the organization, is not opposed to folks making, money because of some great idea and so on. And I think fundamentally this is because we are living in this capitalist system that essentially is built to exploit people. And I'm not going to defend these billionaires, but this is not a bug, it's a feature. They are exploiting the way the system has been shaped. And now I'm speaking obviously as a democratic socialist, as a proud democratic socialist. I don't see how you and I will ever come to a point 10 years from now, if we're still talking about this, or whenever we're going to say, oh, the system has realized this and woken up. I actually think the only way, partly because politicians, as we just talked about in the US, are not defending the people. They're doing it in a very narrow way. I see nothing less than massing in the streets, taking down the system, and having an economic revolution that changes this economic system, because we can't actually reshape it without doing fundamental change.
Okay, so let me debate it with you, but also agree with you. On the agreement part, first let's get something off the table. Billionaires do not need to exist. We don't need people having that much wealth. We agree on that. They are a sign of a broken economic system, right? So let's just get that out of the way. Then the question is, well, okay, if billionaires, and essentially folks who have more money than they know what to do with and are basically buying toys with it, don't need to exist, is there both political opportunity and economic possibility around having a much more regulated form of what is essentially still some version of capitalism? And I think you and I would start from the deep distrust that the capitalist economic model has a tendency to cannibalize anything that looks like regulating its power. And if you don't start from the premise that it won't self-regulate well, it must be curtailed, you're going to be in trouble. So I think we'd agree there. Where I think we can debate, and let me be optimistic about this, I think in this last election, and I wrote the power switch on this premise, that there were politicians were starting to realize that the scale of economic inequality had gotten so bad that you couldn't actually win an election in the United States anymore if you didn't promise to reverse it. So what you had was a populist authoritarian version of reversing it, appealing to the worst in our instincts, to basically say, I am going to offer to tear the whole thing down. I don't need institutions. I don't need anybody but me. And I will have a direct conversation with you and tear the whole thing down. And that was Donald Trump. And he offered it to a lot of working Americans who had been feeling left behind. On the other side, you had some moderates who on their own would never have been able to counter the Trump vote. But what happened was people of color, progressive activists against anti-racism, against inequality, labor, women, climate activists, young people who said, this is what we're going on is rubbish. And the Sanders and Warren people, they came together and said, look, we're not going to elect Joe Biden because we want an essentially moderate to conservative politician to restore the Obama years. We're going to elect Joe Biden because he actually has the capacity to hear where all these progressive actors are, and he will do what is politically possible to do. And my optimism is that we won't be talking about this in 10 years as not having happened, that we are going to see, not because Joe Biden is a visionary, far from it, but because he now realizes what won him Georgia and what won him this election was a set of activists, many of whom come from the progressive world, that if he doesn't tackle economic inequality, he's not going to be around in 4 years, and he's probably going to have a very bad time in 2 years. So we're going to need to see a greater level of ambition on the issues that you're talking about. Does that mean you're wrong that people don't need to get on the streets? No, you're absolutely right. If progressive activists don't show up every which way and say, hey, we put you into office, but now you need to deliver because we are hurting here. We're hurting in communities of color. We're hurting as unions. We're hurting in terms of, yeah, you can rejoin Paris, but we're facing climate catastrophes every year in our societies. We need you to turn rhetoric into action. If he does that, and he won't do it easily, we could be having a different conversation next year. So I don't know if we're debating or not.
I'm good. Well, yes, I'm going to agree again the way you did this. I'm going to agree with some of what you say, but disagree slightly about, if I can say, the bigger picture. You see, I think that if it was true that we wanted to confront the system, we would have elected Bernie Sanders. I think Joe Biden was lucky in that he was running against Donald Trump, and the Democratic Party's mostly the message. I'm going to come to a point you made that's really important. Most of the message was, screw Trump. Trump is a disaster. Get him out. The great organizing that happened, absolutely a factor, and it happened in important states, and it was in some way an anomaly because of the way we elect a president, the Electoral College. That great organizing happened in certain places, but the overall message of the party, in my view, was anti-Trump. And I think you saw that in how many Senate races the Democrats did not win, because they weren't having an economic message to change the system. And where I do agree with you, I think the party is going to get destroyed in 2022 if there isn't kind of the sweeping change that Bernie Sanders and progressives and those people on the ground in Georgia were advocating for. I think that the last point I'll make, that where I agree with you, I think one thing that has happened with Joe Biden, the moment has made him have to be someone slightly different than who he has been his whole entire political career. The pandemic is forcing upon him the kind of spending. And if you look at what Janet Yellen is saying, the same thing is true. They realize that just from an economic standpoint, they can't do business as usual. But I'm not convinced that that's not a slight moment of a change right now, and that once the pandemic is over, that they, hopefully not the people, they are going to snap back to where they were before.
Yeah, I think.
But we'll see.
Yeah, we will see, and I hope our more optimistic scenarios play out. But I think you're right, and I hope they understand how much is in play right now. I wasn't thrilled when you look across the board at the nominations that we didn't get more, explicitly progressive leaders in key cabinet roles, but. I do think you're right that we're seeing a different Biden now, in part because the one thing we know about him is that he does look out at the world of people who got him elected and try to understand what they want from him. He's probably not going to push to the left before they do, but if they do push to the left, I'm hoping he can hear it.
So thank you for, as usual, for really bringing this to us. And I urge my audience to both go to Oxfam's website, read this report, find Paul's book, his new book, which is really an important book to read. We talked about this on my last chat with Paul. You can see that in our archive. And of course, you and I, Paul, are going to continue to have this debate and have this discussion, and we'll have you back in the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Jonathan. Great to talk to you as always.